Some stories end with a victory. This one ends with something quieter than that. A god who has lost everything, his mother, his brother, his people, his certainty, finally stops asking whether he is worthy and starts asking something more important. What does he want to be, now that the hammer is no longer the measure of the man? Tonight, we find out. Welcome to Sanctum Stories. Settle in, get comfortable, let the day fall away. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. Just listen and let the story carry you. There is a particular kind of evening when the sky looks deep enough to fall into. You may have had one, a night when the stars were very clear and very far, and you had the unusual sensation that the distance between yourself and everything beyond was not simply a measurement, but a kind of invitation, as if the dark were not empty, but full, quietly waiting to be navigated by someone patient and curious enough to try. On a night like that, if you stepped off the edge of the familiar and into that dark, if you had the means and the knowledge and the particular kind of courage that comes not from fearlessness, but from looking steadily at something enormous and choosing to walk toward it anyway, you might find, at a distance that has no comfortable number attached to it, a bridge. A bridge made entirely of light. It crosses the void between worlds like a thread of color, drawn by someone who never heard the word impossible. Not one color, but all of them, laid over one another in patient, shimmering bands. Purples that deepen to black at their edges. Ambers that open into gold, the particular blue of deep water seen from beneath. Greens that have no name in any language you have learned. They do not compete with each other. They give way, gently, each to the next, the way one musical note resolves into another when a song is written by someone who knows what they are doing. The bridge arcs across the nothing with the unhurried certainty of something that does not need to justify itself. It has always been here. It will always be here. The universe has arranged itself accordingly. If you were standing on it now, and settle in, because in a certain sense, tonight you are, the first thing you would notice is the sound. Not quite heard, felt. A deep, slow vibration that begins somewhere beneath your feet and travels upward through your bones and comes to rest in your chest like a second heartbeat. Somewhere between the lowest note a cello can hold and the first warmth of a fire catching in a cold room. The Asgardians stopped noticing it centuries ago. They crossed the bridge the way you cross a familiar threshold, without ceremony, without looking down. But the bridge knows they are there. It hums for them still, patient and enormous, doing its impossible work. And at the far end of that bridge, rising from the rock of the realm the way mountains rise, as though they could not imagine doing otherwise, stands a city. This is Asgard. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders find somewhere to be. There's nothing urgent here, and nothing you need to hold on to tonight. The city is difficult to describe without sounding as though you are making it up. Golden spires, yes, but that phrase does not prepare you for the weight of them. These are towers that have stood long enough to carry the memory of the hands that shaped them. The architects who are now legend. The quarriers whose names the oldest stones still hold, the way old books hold the pressed shapes of flowers. They rise without apology from the bedrock of the realm, catching the light of a sky that is never quite decided between late afternoon and early stars. The effect, gold above, deep blue below, every shade of amber and rose between, is the kind of thing painters spend lifetimes attempting and come away from thoughtful. Below the towers, the city breathes at a slower pace. Healers move through long, cool colonnades, speaking quietly about the work of the day. Water, fed from somewhere high in the palace, by channels no one alive can entirely account for, threads its way down through courtyard after courtyard until it reaches Asgard's great edge and falls in long, silver curtains into the dark below. The sound of it carries through the city at night, and there are Asgardians who have fallen asleep to that sound for 1,000 years and still find it settling. Beneath all of it, beneath the rock and the foundations and the deep waterways carved by 10,000 years of purpose, Asgard floats in space. The stars wheel slowly beneath the city's roots, vast and unhurried. The people of Asgard know this the way you know the structure of your own home. Not consciously, most of the time, but with a certainty so deep it has become part of the body. They live in the light above, the dark is below, and the arrangement has held for longer than most histories bother to count. They are not gods, these people, though the civilizations of Earth called them so, and were not entirely wrong to do it. They live for thousands of years. They feel joy and grief and love and shame with the full force of any living thing, only with more time to feel them in. A human grief might last a season before the world begins to call you back. An Asgardian grief can become a country you inhabit for decades, with its own climate and its own geography. There is room there for things to go very deep. This is relevant. It will become more relevant. They are older than the word God usually suggests, and more complicated than most stories built around that word tend to allow. They are ruled, and have been ruled, for longer than their own songs can reliably trace, by the house of Odin. In the palace at the city's heart, past the great hall and the throne room, and the libraries where scrolls contain histories so old they have begun to contradict each other. There is a corridor where the afternoon light falls sideways through narrow windows in long gold bars across pale stone. Through that corridor, at some point in the long history of what is about to begin, a boy comes running. He is not yet the figure that history will make of him, not yet the broad-shouldered, storm-scarred man who will lose nearly everything and choose to carry it anyway. He is young, already large in a way that suggests the frame of a man he has not quite grown into, and already entirely too loud for the libraries, which he passes through at a run because the spark of a sparring session or a dare or some invented crisis is always more compelling than the slow pleasures of the written word. He moves through the palace with the absolute ease of a child who grew up inside something grand and no longer sees the grandeur. The gold is just the wall. The bridge is just the road. His name is Thor, Odin's firstborn son. He knows the crown is waiting. He knows the hammer, Mjolnir, forged in the heart of a dying star by dwarves who worked 3 days without sleeping and came away from the forge changed, will one day answer his call like a trusted friend returning. These things are simply the shape of the world as he understands it, the way you understand the rooms of your childhood home, not something you chose or earned, just something you know, because you have always known it. At his shoulder, always at some angle or another, there is his brother, Loki, darker and quicker, and watching everything from a slight remove, even when he is standing right beside you. He has a talent for finding the precise, unexpected word, the way water finds the low path, without apparent effort, almost as reflex. He can be at your side in the golden hall one moment, and sliding through the shadows of the corridor ahead of you the next. He plays tricks that range from merely aggravating to genuinely inspired. He has a gift for finding the one thing you didn't know you needed to hear and delivering it sideways in the middle of something else, with the particular air of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment and is pleased it has finally come. He is the kind of presence that sharpens you, even when you don't want to be sharpened. These two grew up in these halls together, and the shape of each of them was made, in part, by the presence of the other. If you had been there, in that corridor, or in any of the rooms Thor moved through as a young man, you might have noticed something that the grander versions of this story tend to skip over in their hurry to get to the part where he picks up the hammer. You would have noticed that he was happy. Not in a complicated way, not the careful, considered happiness of someone who has thought it through and decided to be grateful. Just simply, unreflectively, completely happy, in the way of a person who has been given a life that fits them and has had no reason yet to examine whether it was given or earned. He belonged to Asgard entirely, and Asgard belonged to him entirely, and the match was so seamless that he had no mechanism yet for seeing it clearly. His mother, Frigga, watched this with a small, private understanding. She was one of the finest sorcerers the Nine Realms had produced, and she had the particular kind of intelligence that noticed what people were not saying alongside what they were. She loved her son with a love that required nothing from him, did not ask him to be more than he was, or different than he was, or further along than he was. And she saw, with absolute clarity, what he was not yet. She held this knowledge the way she held most of her serious things, quietly and with patience, and without making him feel the weight of it before he was ready. Odin watched with something more complicated. He had ruled for a very long time and had paid for his long view in the currency that long views always cost. He had waged wars and buried people he loved and made decisions that could not be unmade and lived for centuries with the particular shape that irreversible decisions leave behind. He was ancient in the way that carries accumulated weight rather than dust. And when he looked at his son, golden, certain, magnificent, entirely unprepared, he saw both what Thor might become and the long, costly distance between here and there. He allowed the coronation to approach. He said less than he knew, as parents sometimes do when they understand that certain things cannot be explained. They can only be arrived at. The hammer hung in its chamber with the patience of something that understands time differently. The enchantment placed upon it is simple enough to say, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if they be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." It is not simple enough to understand. Worthiness, as it turns out, is not a state you arrive at once and keep, the way you keep a scar or a skill. It shifts with you. It asks new things of you as you change. It is one of those words that means more the longer you look at it, rather than less. Thor did not think about this very much. He assumed the hammer would be his, because the hammer had always been destined to be his, and the assumption was not wrong. Mjolnir would come to him, as the throne would come, as all of it would come, because the world had been arranged that way for as long as he had been alive. He simply did not yet understand the terms of the arrangement. No one told him. Perhaps no one knew, quite, how to say it in a way that would reach him yet. There is a version of this story where someone does say it early, pulls him aside in a pale stone corridor, and explains that what is waiting for him is not simply power, but a question, and that the question will be asked of him personally, in the cold of a world far from home, without warning, and that the asking will not be comfortable. There is a version of this story where he is warned and prepared, and the road is a little less costly. But that is not how it happened, and the fact that it happened the harder way is, in some sense, the whole story. Let us stay here for a moment before things change. Asgard in this hour is as it has always been. The water is threading its way down through the pale stone channels. The Bifrost is humming at the city's edge, doing its patient, impossible work. In one of the palace's inner rooms, Frigga is reading, or half-reading, present in that particular way of hers that asks nothing and offers everything. Odin is in his private chambers, sitting with thoughts he has not yet found words for. Loki is somewhere with his own counsel, as he always is. And somewhere in the long corridors of the palace, the boy who will become the man is still running, still moving with the full body certainty of someone who has never had cause to stop and look at his own feet. The gold is just the wall. The bridge is just the road. The hammer is just the hammer that will one day be his. He has no reason yet to wonder whether he deserves any of it. That question is coming. It will arrive without ceremony, from a direction he is not watching, at the worst possible moment, which is, of course, exactly when questions of this kind tend to arrive, and it will ask him to lay down every certainty he has ever possessed, in the cold and the dark, with no audience and no assurance that doing so will make any difference at all. But that is tomorrow's story, and tonight we are still in the warmth. Let the image of the city settle around you now. The spires are catching the last amber of a sky that cannot make up its mind. The water falls in long, silver threads from Asgard's edge, unhurried, finding its way into the dark below. Somewhere in the city, a lamp has been lit against the evening, and its light falls across pale stone in a small, warm square. The Bifrost hums at the edge of everything, steady as breath, steady as a heartbeat, as patient as the bridge itself has always been. The story will find its way to the hard parts in its own time. Every good story does, but that is not what tonight is for. Tonight, let the hum of the bridge settle into your chest and stay there. Let the golden light do what it has always done. Hold the dark at a comfortable arm's length, quiet and unhurried, for as long as the night requires. The city is still. The stars are turning slowly where the dark begins, far below Asgard's roots. Rest now. The training yard in Asgard holds warmth in its pale stone, the way certain places hold memory, longer than they should, quietly, without being asked. If you had stood there on any ordinary morning in those early centuries, you might have heard it before you saw anything, the crack of a hammer against a practice post, and then a voice, already laughing. The laughter is the thing to notice, not the impact, the laughter. He was young, and the hammer was large for his age, and he had missed by a distance that another child might have found discouraging. He found it interesting. He picked the hammer up again and felt the weight of it settle into his grip, the particular comfort of something that recognized its owner, and he smiled at it privately, the smile of a one-sided conversation with something that doesn't speak, but seems, somehow, to be listening. Then he swung again. He did not miss the second time. Let your breathing settle. Nothing to carry tonight. Just this. Loki, if you had looked for him, would not have been where you expected. That was the first thing to understand about Loki. You looked where he was supposed to be and found the space he had just left. He moved through the palace the way certain kinds of intelligence move through any environment. At angles, through the seams, arriving in places before anyone watching had worked out the logic of his arrival. He was not hiding, exactly. He was simply somewhere else, and that somewhere always turned out to be exactly where something interesting was happening, or about to. On this particular morning, he was above the training yard, on a narrow decorative wall, 3 stories up, where the drop on the far side was significant, and no one climbed because there was no practical reason to. He had been there for some time. He was watching his brother. Not because he wanted to fight. Loki's relationship with physical combat was always more theoretical than personal. He understood it, studied it, knew where the openings were. He preferred not to stand in them when other options existed, and other options usually existed if you were willing to think sideways. He was watching because Thor was, when you stripped everything else away, the most interesting person he had ever encountered. Both of these things were true at once, the most interesting and the most exasperating, and Loki had long since decided these were probably inseparable. Their mother understood this about them before either of them did. Frigga moved through the palace with a calm that was not the absence of feeling, but the careful distribution of it. Warmth that touched everything without announcing itself, the way good light fills a room. She was the person in any room who had been paying the most attention for the longest, and what she had been paying attention to these past decades were her 2 sons. She taught Loki magic. This was understood early as simply sensible, a gift recognized and cultivated the way you tend anything rare, carefully, with patience for the process. She taught him illusion first, because illusion is the deepest magic. Not tricks, but the understanding that appearances are less fixed than they seem. That reality is a story told by light and expectation, and the person who can read that story can sometimes choose to tell it differently. He had the instinct for it from the beginning, the way some children have instinct for music, encountering a thing and recognizing it as already known. She watched him learn in an afternoon what others spent years approaching, and was careful, very careful, to respond with steadiness rather than amazement. Prodigies who are treated as wonders tend to stop asking how much further there is to go. Thor, she taught different things, not formally. His formal education lived in the training yard and the sparring rings. But she taught him anyway, in the way that attentive mothers teach the things that have no lesson plans. By example, by listening. She gave him her full attention when he spoke, and he noticed this, though he could not have said why it mattered so much. She remembered the small things. She noticed what he was afraid of before he noticed himself, and she never named it directly. She simply arranged circumstances with a quiet precision of someone with a great deal of time and a great deal of love, so that the fear had somewhere to go. Odin, for his part, was honest with his sons in the way that powerful men are sometimes honest, directly, usefully, without necessarily warming the truth before he delivered it. He told them the world was not simple. He told them their task would be to navigate it wisely. Then he watched, with a patience that ran across centuries, to see whether they would. There is a story from the palace that has been told more times than it strictly needed to be. It gets told whenever Thor is present and someone feels the urge to make him briefly uncomfortable, which is often, and he receives it with the resigned good humor of a man who knows that some stories have simply escaped into the world and cannot be recalled. He loved snakes when he was small, genuinely, unreservedly. He would find them in the palace gardens and carry them inside to show to people who were, to a person, considerably less delighted than he was. He thought this said something about snakes. In retrospect, it says something about Thor, the enormous, uncomplicated warmth he extended toward creatures that most people kept at a careful remove. Loki knew this. Loki knew everything about his brother that it was possible to know. He filed this detail carefully with all the others, in the way that he filed all information, attentively, and with some sense of its eventual use. One afternoon, there was a snake in the garden, a good one, green, placid, the sort of thing that would have been irresistible to a young Thor, and was irresistible to an older Thor as well, because some enthusiasms are structural rather than seasonal. He reached for it. The snake looked back at him. Snakes do not, as a rule, have expressions. Thor registered this discrepancy, and then registered, somewhat faster, that the snake had become his brother, crouching in the grass with the quiet satisfaction of a plan arriving exactly as intended. And then Loki stabbed him. It was minor. Thor was Asgardian, and by the time the surprise had fully resolved into indignation, it was already healing. But the principle of the thing, the absolute precision of the setup, the tranquil smile on the snake's face, the sheer gleeful commitment of it, sent him after Loki through the palace at speed, both of them making enough noise to disturb the guards, an unspecified number of birds, and Frigga, who came out of her study with the expression of a woman who stopped being surprised some years ago and has made her peace with that. The laughter, when it came, was complete. Not the polite laughter of performance, but the kind that falls over you without warning, undignified, unguarded, the kind you couldn't have arranged in advance. Two brothers, one of them bleeding very slightly, both of them helpless. Stay with that sound for a moment. The laughter in the corridor. This is who they were, underneath everything else, under the hammer and the magic and the weight of what was coming. Two people who knew they were safe with each other, even in the middle of being terrible. It was real. Remember that it was real. There was also the challenge. A young man named Brunok delivered an insult to Loki's family in a corridor one afternoon, and discovered, rather faster than anticipated, that this had consequences. The consequence resolved, as things in that company tended to resolve, into a virtue challenge, which was old enough to have forgotten its original purpose, and knew enough that its structure still had teeth. In the first challenge, Thor was alone in a place where voices spoke to him. Not cruel voices. Cruelty would have been simpler to move past. These were certain voices, the kind that know the particular shape of your doubts and speak to them directly, which is more difficult to dismiss than cruelty, because it requires less imagination. Thor's confidence was real and ran deep, and he had not yet encountered much that ran against it. But the voices found the edges anyway, the small private uncertainties that even the most certain person carries somewhere they don't often look. He heard them. He pushed through. He came out the other side and found Loki on a branch, looking somewhat reduced. This is worth sitting with. Loki, who wore composure like a second skin, who could make you feel he had already read the last page of whatever was happening. Loki had not managed the voices as well as his brother. Not because he was weaker, because the voices knew where he was most vulnerable, and where he was most vulnerable was the specific fear of someone who has always had to be clever, because the other things, the ease, the room shifting, the simple, undeniable rightness of presence, had always seemed to belong to someone else. Thor pulled him through, without announcement, without making a moment of it. They continued. Companions gathered in the way that companions gather when a situation keeps requiring people, and the right ones keep appearing. By the end of it, after the cup had been retrieved, and the mine surveyed, and Volstagg had prevented a ceiling collapse through sheer determined physical presence, which is its own kind of heroism, Loki said the thing he had not been saying throughout. He had started all of this because he wanted the respect that seemed to come so naturally to Thor. Not the throne, not exactly. The respect. The structural assumption that what he thought and said and decided mattered. That the room shifted when he entered, the way it always shifted for Thor. He had felt, for too long, the particular invisibility of standing beside something magnificent. Thor heard this. He didn't redirect it or soften it. He apologized for whatever he had done or simply been that made Loki feel that gap. It was a real apology, the kind that knows it can't fix everything and offers itself anyway. Under all the banter and the tricks and the competitive testing of each other's limits, this, the paying attention, the willingness to tell each other true things. They visited Earth, not once, not twice, more than that, over the years, in the casual way that the Asgardians moved between the 9 realms that fell under their protection and care. If you had been in Scandinavia in those centuries, you might have seen them arrive. The people of the North were young, as civilizations go, not simple, but early, building their understanding of the world from what they could observe and survive, as all understanding begins. They looked at storms and made stories about them. They looked at the forces that shaped their lives and gave those forces names and faces and personalities, because that is what minds do with things too large to hold without a handle. The Asgardians arrived and stepped into those stories the way you step through a door that has been standing open for some time. It was not dishonest exactly. The word those people reached for, God, was simply the nearest available shape for something their language didn't yet have a more precise term for, and the Asgardians were not entirely sure the people were wrong. Thor liked them. The Norse people had built their cosmology around something unusual, the certainty that everything ends. The world would burn. The gods would fall. Even the great tree at the center of things would one day be consumed. They carried this knowledge without it breaking them. They feasted regardless. They set out in small wooden ships, onto seas that were openly hostile to the idea of their return, and they went. That was a form of courage Thor understood. Perhaps the form of courage he understood most deeply, though he might not have been able to say why. Loki moved through those same places with different eyes. He was less interested in the storms and the courage. He was interested in the stories themselves, how they formed, what made them take one shape rather than another, how easily the structure of a belief could be shifted by the right word in the right moment. He was learning something on Earth that had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with how understanding works, how it can be led gently in directions that feel like arriving, rather than being guided. Different lessons from the same world. It was always this way between them. The bet happened in 1971, and was, by any measure, perfectly in character. There is a man in the records of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or rather, the deliberate absence of a man, who called himself D.B. Cooper, who boarded a commercial flight in November of that year and left it in a way that should not have been survivable, and demonstrably was, taking with him a sum of money that the authorities spent decades looking for and never found. The case remains technically open. The Bureau does not know this is because D.B. Cooper exists entirely outside their jurisdiction. If you had been watching from a hillside in the Pacific Northwest, an hour or so before any of this, watching two figures argue with the cheerful specificity of people who have been arguing the same argument for centuries, you might have seen Loki produce the alias with the satisfied ease of someone who has had it ready for some time. You might have seen Thor shake his head with the patient exasperation of a man who knows he has already lost, can see exactly how he has already lost, and is going to make the bet anyway, because this is what they do. Loki won. Of course he did. The bet had been constructed in a way that suited his particular skills so precisely that whether it counted as a fair wager is, at minimum, a point worth discussing. With Loki, the line between winning and cheating was always philosophically interesting. Thor bought the drinks. This was the established arrangement. When Thor lost a bet, which happened with predictable regularity because he kept making bets that were essentially bets about which of them was cleverer, drinks were purchased. An accounting of exactly how everything had gone was requested and then delivered with a degree of embellishment that both parties understood and neither bothered to correct, because the embellishment was half the point. Hold that image. Two brothers on a hillside in 1971, the light already going, Loki looking insufferably pleased with himself in the way that only works when the person watching it is also, somewhere underneath, proud of you. Thor with a drink in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and does not particularly mind. This is one of the last entirely uncomplicated afternoons. Not the last afternoon that contains love. The love does not stop. Not really. Not ever entirely, but uncomplicated in this way. Freely given, nothing owed, no weight behind it. The kind of afternoon you only recognize as precious once you are standing some distance from it, looking back. Odin tried to teach Thor that peace was harder than war and more valuable. He said this in various ways across various centuries, with the persistence of someone who knows the lesson has not yet arrived and is not certain it can be delivered from the outside. He was not always a warm man, not in the way Frigga was warm, but he was honest, and he was paying attention. and he saw his son clearly enough to know what the lesson would eventually require. He said that the strength of a king was not the strength of arms, which any good general could manage. He said it was judgment, the ability to understand what a situation needed, rather than defaulting to what you did best. Thor listened. He could repeat these lessons back accurately. He could articulate, in the abstract, precisely why restraint was wisdom and not cowardice. He believed this, genuinely, when the question was theoretical. And then there would be a moment, a border provoked, an insult delivered, a chance to demonstrate what Asgard was capable of, and the lessons would reorganize themselves, quietly, into reasons why this particular case was different, why this situation actually called for the strength of arms, why his father, with the best intentions, was not seeing what was plainly there to be seen. He was not deceiving himself. That is the important thing to understand. He believed it every time. He had the courage for battle and the intelligence to construct a justification for it, which together produce a very specific kind of blindness, the kind that absorbs every outside perspective and converts it, smoothly and without friction, back into confirmation of what it already knew. Odin saw this clearly. He saw it the way certain parents see things in their children that the children cannot yet see in themselves, with patience and with a grief that is partly love and partly the sorrow of knowing that life will have to teach what parents cannot, that the only thing to do in the meantime is wait and love them and try to make sure that when the lesson arrives, it does not break them entirely. It was a very long patience. It ran across centuries. But that is ahead of us. Let it rest there, in the future where it belongs. Let your breathing slow now. Let the chapter settle. Think of those mornings in Asgard, the east-facing rooms, the way light came in early and lay across the pale stone floors before the day shifted it. In those rooms, in those centuries, the shape of everything Thor had becomes visible. A father whose pride was real, even when it was complicated. A mother who knew him entirely, who had watched him be small and loud and certain, who held the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of who he had been at every age, who would carry the fact of his laughter somewhere inside her for as long as she lived. A brother who drove him to the edges of his patience and back again, repeatedly, and who was underneath all of it, entirely his in a way that could not be undone. A hammer that answered his hand. Friends who followed him into situations they had good reason to avoid, cheerfully, without needing to be asked more than once. A kingdom at the end of all of it, waiting with the certainty of something that has always been there. He had never been refused, not by anything that mattered, not yet. He filled rooms the way weather fills rooms, not by intention, simply by being what he was. People stood a little straighter. The day seemed slightly larger. He was warm and loud and almost endearingly certain, and the certainty came from a real place. He had been tested, and he had come through, and the world had so far confirmed everything he believed about himself. He didn't know what loss was. He had the words for it. He'd heard his father speak of costs and distance and the weight of what kingdoms required. He could have told you what loss meant, but knowing the word for a country is not the same as having lived there. Understanding of that kind arrives in its own time, through its own means, without announcement and without permission. For now, the palace was warm, The hammer rested nearby, and somewhere down the corridor, almost certainly, a brother was planning something, patient and precise, and probably already finished in its key details, waiting only for the moment to reveal itself. Let the warmth of it come to rest around you, the gold of those mornings, the sound of laughter in a corridor that still exists, somewhere in the long memory of that place. Sleep now. The story will be here when you wake. If you have ever been caught in a thunderstorm, a real one, not the polite English variety, but the kind that splits the sky in two, you know something of what it feels like to fall from grace. The sky opens without warning. The rain comes not gently, but all at once, cold and indifferent, and entirely unbothered by your plans. And then it is over, and you are standing in the quiet afterward, soaked through, smaller than you were before. That is where we begin tonight, with Thor falling. Through the light of the Bifrost he falls, through the cold between worlds, through dark matter and deep time, past stars that have burned since before Asgard had a name. And when the lightning strikes, not as lightning, just lightning, he hits the earth. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin where it begins. In Asgard's great hall, on a morning that was meant to be the finest of Thor's long life, the All-Father had been moments away from placing the crown upon his son's head. The ceremony had drawn half the realm. The horns had sounded. The crowd had roared. Thor walked the length of that golden hall with the easy confidence of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility that the world might refuse him anything. The sunlight fell through the high windows in long golden shafts. Everything smelled of victory and inevitability. Then Odin paused. Frost giants had been found in the vault, a small group, already slain by the destroyer, but they had been inside Asgard's walls. They had touched the casket of ancient winters. The ceremony was over. To anyone wise, this would have been a moment for cold deliberation, for restraint, for the careful stillness actual kings are made of. But Thor was not then, not in that golden hall, a wise man. He was furious. His day of triumph had been stolen, and fury in Thor, when it burned at full heat, had a way of feeling entirely righteous. He went to Jotunheim. It was reckless. It was against his father's command. He brought Loki and his friends, Sif, the Warriors Three, into the heart of a realm that had every reason to see them as enemies. And when Laufey's people met them with contempt, when a frost giant called him a name, Thor did what Thor did. He swung. What followed was not a battle so much as a demonstration. Thor was magnificent, and he knew it, and he let Jotunheim feel it, throwing Mjolnir across the frozen wasteland with the exhilarating ease of a man who has never once had to earn what he could do. Right up until the moment Odin arrived on Sleipnir, his face the color of stone, and ended it. On the Bifrost Bridge, with Fandral bleeding from a frost giant's touch, Odin turned his full attention on his son. He did not shout. That was somehow worse. "You are a vain, cruel, selfish boy," he said, "and you have just reignited a war." Thor argued. He always did. He called his father weak, an old man, a fool afraid of his enemies, and something in Odin shifted, not with anger, but with the specific sadness of a man who had hoped he was wrong about something and discovered he was not. He had thought, perhaps, that the best of his son was ready to emerge. He saw now that it was not. "You are unworthy," Odin said, and he meant every syllable. Mjolnir came first. Odin lifted it from Thor's hand, and Thor felt the absence like a wound, the hammer suddenly just an object in someone else's grip. Then Odin spoke the enchantment into the metal. Whosoever holds this hammer, if they be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. The hammer flew through the Bifrost toward Earth. Then Thor followed it, stripped of his armor and his power and his name, cast through the same void into the same desert. He arrived in a flash of light that was not his own, landing hard in the sand of New Mexico under a vast, indifferent sky. He lay there for a moment. Just a man in the dark. Hammer? He said, sitting up and looking around wildly. Hammer! His voice carried the remains of divine authority, but it fell flat in the thin desert air. If you have ever been somewhere that does not care who you are, a city that goes on going without you, you know something of that feeling. The silence that meets a voice that expects to be heard. Jane Foster found him almost immediately, or her truck did. She was out in the desert that night with her instruments and her theories, chasing electromagnetic readings that suggested the impossible. She did not expect to find a person stumbling in the dark. She ran him over, gently, twice. You would like her if you could meet her. A scientist in love with the universe, not because it was her profession, but because she genuinely could not help it. That night, she found a very large, very confused man in the sand, and she did what curious and kind people do. She took him to get pancakes. Thor, who had feasted in the halls of Asgard for centuries, found himself genuinely hungry for the first time in memory. The food tastes different when you need it rather than want it. Richer, more real. He ate with the concentrated attention of someone whose body had just remembered it could starve. Then someone at the diner mentioned a satellite, a thing from the sky, 50 miles west, that had come down hard enough to leave a crater. Thor set down his fork. He knew what it was. The facility that had grown up around Mjolnir was a testament to human speed. Within hours of the hammer's landing, an entire research station had materialized in the desert. Portable buildings, floodlights, perimeter guards, the whole apparatus of an organization that has learned to move quickly toward things it does not understand. In the center of it all, under a canopy, the hammer rested in the sand. Thor saw it from the ridge, felt something in his chest unknot with relief. There, just there, all he had to do was reach it, and this would end. He would be himself again. If you could have watched him make his way through that facility, past the guards, past the floodlights, past all the instruments measuring the incomprehensible, you might have felt something for him, the certainty in his stride, the absolute assurance that what he was walking toward would solve everything. He stood before the hammer, closed both hands around the handle, and pulled. Nothing. He shifted his feet in the sand, found his grip, and pulled harder. His breath went short. He strained with everything he had, with muscles that had carried storms, that had knocked giants off their feet, that had thrown this very hammer across the void between worlds. The hammer did not move. In all his long life, through every battle, every test, every contest of strength, the hammer had always known him. He had never once had to strain for it. He had lifted it the way you breathe, the way you walk. It was part of what he was, and now it was a thing in the sand. If you have ever reached for something you were absolutely certain would be there, and found nothing, you know something of that moment. The sudden vertiginous absence, the hand that finds only air. Thor sank to his knees. The rain that began to fall was not his doing. That is important. It was just weather. Earth's weather, indifferent and natural, and wholly unconnected to his emotional state. It fell on him as it falls on everyone, as though he were simply a person, and the sky had not noticed. He let the agents take him without resistance. There was nothing left to resist with. The interrogation room smelled of coffee. An agent named Coulson asked careful questions. Thor said very little. And then, between one breath and the next, Loki was there. His brother looked precisely as you would expect a man to look who was delivering unbearable news with great reluctance. The care of the performance was extraordinary. But Thor, sitting in that room with the bottom fallen out of his world, was not in any condition to read the care. "Father is dead," Loki said quietly. The Odin sleep took him. The weight of everything, the frost giants, your exile, it was too much. And Mother has forbidden your return. The peace with Jotunheim depends on your absence. The words arrived one at a time. Odin was dead. It was his fault. He could not go home. "I never meant," Thor started. "I know," Loki said. And then he was gone. Thor sat alone in the room that smelled of coffee and understood, for the first time in his life, that a future could close, not redirect, close, like a door going dark, like a fire going out. He had always assumed that he would come back from things, that the next morning would find him still himself, with all the resources he had always had. It had never occurred to him that one bad morning could be the last morning that looked like all the others. That night, he sat with Eric Selvig in a bar and listened. Selvig talked about men he had known, soldiers, mostly, who came back from places that had taken everything and found the ordinary world had become a foreign country. The streets looked the same. The language was the same. But the man inside the familiar body had been changed, and changing back was not an option. Thor had no answer to this. He was beginning to suspect he had more in common with those men than he would once have thought. The following morning he made breakfast, returned Isabella's mug, the one he had smashed on his first day, demanding more coffee with the easy entitlement of someone who has never had to be polite. It was a small thing. He did not perform it for any audience. He thought it was right to correct a small wrong, and he went and corrected it. It was not heroism. It was something smaller and more honest. The beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. That evening, he and Jane sat together on the roof of the research center and looked at the stars. She talked about her work, wormholes, dimensional theory, the possibility of bridges between worlds, the equations she had been running, the data she was still trying to explain. And Thor, who had walked those worlds and taken their wonders entirely for granted, found himself listening to the universe being described back to him by someone who had never seen it and was in love with it anyway. She had built her understanding from mathematics and inference and persistent hope. He had been handed his as a birthright and had barely looked at it. There was something astonishing about that. When she fell asleep beside him under the vast desert sky, he stayed awake and watched the stars, the same stars he had always lived among, and felt, for the first time, something that might have been gratitude. His friends came the next morning, Sif and the Warriors 3, arriving through a wormhole with their familiar warmth and noise and the very welcome news that Odin was alive. The exile stood, but it was not permanent. There was hope. But before the word could settle, the desert sky shifted. Another wormhole tearing it open, and through it, something enormous walked out of the shimmer and onto the road. If you have been listening carefully, you may already know what follows, or something close to it. And if you have, then let this be the version that you carry with you into sleep. Not the metal and the fire and the forces colliding. Those are not where this story lives. What matters is the moment before. Thor's friends fought. They gave everything they had, and it was not enough. The warriors 3 were down. The town was evacuating. And Thor, powerless, mortal, as ordinary as any man on that street, walked out to meet it anyway. No plan. No weapon. He walked forward because someone had to, and he was the reason the town was in danger, and so the choice was not difficult. It was almost simple. "Brother," he said to the air, to the creature, to wherever Loki was watching from, "I know what I've done wrong. I know I've failed you, failed everyone who believed in me. But these people have done nothing. Take me instead, and let them go." The destroyer paused, just for a moment, a beat of impossible stillness on a desert road. And then it struck him, and he fell, and the world went very quiet. He lay on the street. Jane was there, kneeling over him. The town was safe. That was enough. Briefly, he thought this was not the worst way for things to end. And then he thought nothing at all. What happened next, he learned afterward. Mjolnir moved. Deep in the SHIELD compound, under its canopy, the hammer that had not moved for anyone, not for all the scientists who had measured and puzzled over it, not for all the agents who had tried, simply rose from the earth and flew. It found his hand. There is no precise way to describe what worthiness looks like, measured on whatever scale the enchantment uses. He had not solved a puzzle or passed a test. He had been willing to die for people he barely knew, because it was right, and there was no one else. Whether that was wisdom, or love, or the first genuine thought he had ever had that was not about himself, the hammer made its own determination. The lightning returned like a tide coming in, not a switch thrown, but something remembered. He stood. The armor came. The air smelled of rain and ozone. He was Thor. The destroyer was ended, and that is enough to say about that. This is not where the chapter lives. Jane's research was returned. A promise was made and meant. Then the Bifrost opened, and he went home. What he found in Asgard was a brother he barely recognized, and a truth he had not been standing still long enough to see. Loki had arranged all of it. The frost giants in the vault, perfectly timed for the coronation. The exile, architected with a craftsman's precision. And the destroyer, sent not to test Thor, but to end him. And Laufey, invited through the vault's open door, and then killed, to prove something terrible to a father whose approval Loki had long since stopped expecting, and never quite stopped wanting. Their fight began as these things do, with words exhausting themselves, with old pain dressed up as argument. It ended on the Rainbow Bridge, with Loki holding the Bifrost open, pointed at Jotunheim, burning a corridor through a realm he might have been born to, as though destruction were the same as belonging. Thor destroyed the bridge to stop him, lost the path back to Earth, back to Jane, lost it anyway, because there were billions of lives on the other side, and some costs are the cost. The blast launched them both into the void, and Odin was there, awakened from the Odin sleep, catching them both at the bridge's broken edge. 2 suns above an abyss, suspended by a hand that still chose to hold them both. Loki looked up at his father and said what he had never let himself say plainly, that he had done it all for him, to be worthy of him, to finally be enough. And Odin said no, not cruelly, not loudly, just no, with the grief of a father who loves his son and cannot lie to him, who cannot give him the answer that would make the terrible thing he had done mean something better than it meant. Loki looked into his father's face and found no comfort there. He let go, not dramatically, not as a performance, simply released his grip and let the dark take him, as though it was easier than continuing to hold on, as though holding on had already cost more than he had. Thor reached for him. He was not fast enough. The void took his brother, and the void gave nothing back. Asgard celebrated that night. The warriors 3 raised cups. Songs were sung. It was the kind of evening that did not know it was missing something. Thor moved through the edges of it, touching Frigga's hand as he passed, and walked out of the hall into the dark. He stood at what remained of the Rainbow Bridge, the splintered end of it, jagged against the dark, and looked out at the stars he could no longer cross. Somewhere among them, Jane Foster was pointing instruments at the sky. He had told her he would come back. He did not know now how that would be possible. Heimdall found him there, told him she was looking too. There's peace in that, small and real, and carried at some cost. The kind of peace that arrives not when things are resolved, but when you understand what matters and know that it still exists. Somewhere, even if you cannot reach it tonight. Thor had learned, in a few days of desert and powerlessness and ordinary pancakes, something that all the battles across all the 9 realms had never managed to teach him. That to stand for something, you first have to be willing to fall. That strength without that willingness is just noise. And that worthiness, the kind the hammer measures, has nothing to do with power. It has everything to do with what you choose when the power is gone. He had chosen. He would live with what that had cost him. The desert of New Mexico grows still now, as deserts do after significance has moved on. The glass in the crater is already filling with sand. The floodlights are gone. The portable buildings, the perimeter guards, all of it packed away, leaving only the desert and the sky, and the ordinary business of stars going on being stars. But if you were there on a clear night, and you lay down in the sand and looked up, you might feel something that doesn't quite have a name. The memory of a man on his knees in the rain, reaching for something that would not come, learning, for the first time, what it feels like to not be enough. That man, and the understanding he carried after, was worth more than anything the hammer had ever given him. Let your breathing slow a little. The desert holds the warmth of the day long after the sun is gone, and there's something generous about that, something worth resting in. The god of thunder has learned to whisper. Somewhere among the stars, a bridge of light is being slowly rebuilt, not because it was always going to be rebuilt, but because someone chose to destroy it, and destruction is not the same as ending. Some things that are broken can still become something else. Sometimes what's lost is the cost of what you were trying to protect, and the protection was worth it, and you learn to carry both. Sleep now. The desert is still, and the warmth of the day is still here, held in the sand long after the sun has gone. Let it hold you a while longer. The lightning arrives before he does. That is how it always is with Thor The storm announces him, the sky shifts, and then he is there, kneeling on a mountain in the dark, breathing the thin air of a world he was not born to, letting his eyes adjust to the quality of Earth's night. Back not to protect, not yet. Back because his brother is alive. Let that settle for a moment. 2 years of mourning, and then word from Heimdall, from Frigga, delivered to him across the dark. Loki is not dead. He fell, and he survived, and he is here, on this world, doing something that will require Thor to stop him. The relief of it is real. It arrived in a rush, and it has not quite left. But relief and dread are not always opposites, and as Thor rises from the mountain and begins to move, he carries both. The reunion happens under open sky, away from anyone else's eyes. Thor finds his brother, and for one moment he holds him by the shoulders and feels the solidity of him. This face he had learned to think of as a face he would not see again. The conversation had gone differently in his imagination, but Loki's eyes are wrong, not absent, not empty, occupied differently, as though something has taken up residence in the spaces behind them and rearranged the furniture. Those eyes he has known his entire life, their moods, their deflections, the specific shapes of hurt they dress as contempt. What he is seeing now has a different quality. It is colder, and there is something else beneath it that Thor cannot quite name, the shadow of a place he has not been. "I thought you dead," Thor says. The honesty of it is unguarded. "We mourned you. Odin mourned you." The name, Odin, lands between them. Loki's expression shifts in a way that is almost imperceptible and entirely legible to Thor, who has been reading it since childhood. "Did he mourn the sun, or the lie?" Loki asks. There is genuine pain in this, underneath the composure. The brother I was, or the weapon I was meant to become? Thor does not have an answer prepared. He is searching for one, searching Loki's face for the brother he knows, trying to gauge how far back he has retreated from this new and strange exterior, when the red and gold shape drops from the sky and lands with entirely too much confidence on the rock between them. "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the reindeer games," Tony Stark says, and Thor finds himself oddly charmed by this mortal's audacity. On Asgard, few would interrupt a conversation between princes. On Earth, apparently, they do it with jokes. They fought, briefly, less briefly than it needed to be. Two men used to being the most powerful presence in any given situation will sometimes do that before they think about whether it's necessary. A soldier appeared, a man with a shield and a moral clarity that cut through the noise better than any weapon. And the fighting stopped because he made the case for stopping. And they both recognized, if they were honest, that he was right. They had the same goal. Thor had needed a moment to remember it. If you had been watching from a great height that day, watching these three men stand in a clearing in a ruined forest, the trees around them bearing the evidence of their argument, you might have wondered what they were doing. You would have seen a god, a man in armor, and a soldier from another era, standing very close together in the dark, their shoulders dropping as they came to some wordless agreement. That was the beginning of it. Earth had assembled its own protectors, and they were nothing like what Thor expected. He had expected weapons, tools, perhaps, or instruments of policy. What he found instead on the great ship that floated above the clouds was something stranger and more interesting. People. A woman who held herself with a specific economy of movement, never still in the way of rest, but in the way of a sentence already composed, waiting for the right moment to be delivered. A man with a bow who made the impossible look like habit. A doctor who maintained a careful calm that suggested he was always holding something much larger, very gently in check, the way you carry a jar of something volatile. Both hands, full attention, no sudden movements. People who had not been made by destiny or prophecy, who had found their way to this place through an accumulation of choices, none of which had necessarily pointed here. Thor watched them argue and found he was less certain about things he had once considered settled, about what strength was, about what it was for. Loki was playing a game. He had been playing it from the beginning. Thor saw it clearly enough. The performance inside the cell, the careful provocations, the smile worn like a costume. His brother had come to that ship deliberately. The only question was what he wanted from it. The answer arrived in smoke and fire. Hawkeye, under Loki's influence, moving through the helicarrier's systems with the focused efficiency of a man completing a task. The explosion came, and with it, the long, tilting groan of something vast beginning to fail, and Bruce Banner, past his limit now, becoming something that could not be reached by reason. These are not things Thor needs to revisit in detail. They resolved, as crises do, with luck and cost in roughly equal measure, and the ship steadied, and the battle inside it was over, and in the quiet that followed, Thor went to find his brother. The cell was empty. Loki stood outside it, and then, with the elegant simplicity of something designed well in advance, Thor was inside it. Loki looked at him through the glass with an expression that Thor recognized from childhood. The expression of someone who has been planning something for a long time and is now watching it go exactly as planned. There was a satisfaction in it, and beneath the satisfaction, something else. The name for it didn't come. "The humans think us immortal," Loki said. "Should we test that theory?" He did not drop the cage. What stopped him was not mercy. It was Phil Coulson, walking toward him with something fashioned from the remains of the destroyer, and the quiet nerve of a man who does not think he will survive what he is walking toward, and keeps walking anyway. Some courage only becomes visible in retrospect. Coulson was steady and unhurried, and he placed himself between danger and his ship without calculation or announcement, the way people do when they have thought about who they want to be and made their decision in advance. He did not manage to stop what happened, but he bought something with what it cost him, and what he bought mattered. Thor, watching from behind glass he could not break fast enough, carried the weight of that. The cell fell. Thor broke free in time, hammered his way out and into an empty field, and stood in the dark, trying to collect himself. His grief and his rage, and the ache of having failed to stop something he could see coming. He was separated from the others. Mjolnir lay a short distance away, and he walked to it and stood there for a moment before he picked it up, recalling the lessons Odin had tried, with varying success, to teach him. Calm, then clarity, then the lightning came. Rest here for a moment. The night is quiet, and none of this is yours to carry, only to witness from a warm distance. Let your breath slow. New York was burning when he arrived, but Thor did not experience the battle the way a story told afterward makes it sound. He was not watching from above, cataloging movements, tracing tactics. He was in it, one moment at a time, one decision at a time, moving through something vast and chaotic and occasionally beautiful as a storm is beautiful, if you can hold both the danger and the light of it in mind simultaneously. You might have seen the lightning on the Chrysler Building if you had been looking up. The whole of the upper city lit blue for a moment, and then another, as he poured everything he had into slowing what was coming through. That is not what he would tell you he remembers years later. What he would tell you is this: the moment he realized he trusted them, not trusted them to be powerful. Power was not the interesting thing about these people, though some of them had it. What he recognized was something more specific: the quality of people who have made a decision about what they are willing to give and are not renegotiating in the middle of giving it. The soldier who understood what the moment required and gave it without calculation. The spy who sealed the portal while everyone else was still deciding if it could be done. The man in the metal suit who picked up a nuclear weapon and flew it toward empty space alone, without having had the conversation about whether he was going to do it, because the math said it needed to be done, and so he did it. If you had asked Thor before that day what worthiness looked like, he would have described something that looked a great deal like himself: divine, strong, destined, carrying a weapon made to measure the quality of its bearer. He was beginning to understand that worthiness had a different shape than he had imagined, that it was less about what you were made of and more about what you did with what you had. That these people, assembled here by accident and urgency and the sheer desperation of a world with no better option, these people were exactly what Mjolnir was pointing at, every time it recognized something true. The battle ended. Loki had been beaten, not by Thor, though they had fought across the rooftops of that tower the way brothers fight. Everything you have, and a lifetime's knowledge of every opening the other person has never managed to close. Loki had smiled at him in the middle of it, the way he sometimes smiled when the outcome of a thing was no longer in doubt. It was not a happy smile. It was a tired one. The Hulk found him before Thor did. The conversation, if you could call it that, was brief. Loki, when Thor came to collect him, was face down in a dent that fitted him rather precisely. He protested about the indignity of it. Thor let him. Someone suggested shawarma. Thor was not entirely sure what shawarma was. He still is not entirely sure it can be considered a complete meal by any rigorous standard. But the restaurant had survived the afternoon, which felt like a minor miracle of structural engineering, and they went in, the 6 of them, and sat down at a table and ordered and ate. If you could see that table, if you could stand in the doorway of that damaged restaurant and look at the 6 people sitting around it, you might not immediately recognize what you were looking at. They were very tired. Most of them had minor injuries they were not discussing. Tony was making a low joke to no one in particular, what Tony does when he needs to say something and hasn't found the shape of it yet. Steve was running through the day in his head. You could see it in his face, the steady audit he was performing of what had happened and what it had cost. Natasha and Clint were communicating in the shorthand of people who have been through too much together to need full sentences. A glance, a small adjustment, something that didn't have to be said aloud. Bruce was being very still, with the specific, careful stillness of someone who is a gift to the people around him precisely because of how seriously he takes the responsibility of being himself. and Thor was watching all of them. Just 6 people, sharing a meal, too tired for celebration, but grateful to be alive. He had sat at feasts that lasted for days in Asgard's great golden halls. Feasts where the cups never emptied, and the fire never dimmed, and the songs were old enough that no one remembered who had first sung them. He had celebrated victories in 100 different halls across a dozen different realms. None of them had felt quite like this. The difference was the choosing. These people had not been born to this table. They had not been arranged here by prophecy or lineage or the slow gravity of destiny. They had arrived through an accumulation of small decisions, each made when it would have been simpler not to, when sitting this one out was an option, when the personal cost was high and the outcome was uncertain, and someone else might have stepped forward instead. The choosing, freely made, imperfectly made anyway, that was what gave the meal its weight. That was what made it feel, despite the chipped cups and the rubble dust on the table, and the entirely reasonable exhaustion of everyone present, like something that mattered. Settle in now. Let whatever you're carrying ease a little. The journey back to Asgard with Loki in chains is quiet. They pass through the Bifrost, that river of light and sound and impossible color, and Thor does not look behind him. He looks at his brother, who stands with his wrists bound and his posture arranged into something that suggests dignity is still available to him, regardless of circumstances. Loki's face is composed, as it almost always is, but Thor has been watching that face his entire life. He is thinking about what Loki said on the mountain. Did he mourn the sun or the lie? There is no clean answer to this. Odin loved Loki. Thor does not doubt this, but Odin's love, like much of what Odin did, was complicated by purpose, by the long calculations of a king who has always been thinking several moves ahead. Whether he mourned the child or the arrangement, the son or the political solution, is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. Perhaps Odin could not have answered it himself. Thor does not know what happened in the dark between worlds, in the places Loki went after the Bifrost was destroyed, and before he appeared on Earth with someone else's army and someone else's purpose threaded through him. He may never fully know, but he knows the look on his brother's face in the moment before the knife came out on the rooftop. That complicated flicker, the moment that could have gone a different way. He knows the tears that Loki did not quite allow himself to shed. He knows that whatever else is true, his brother is in pain. That does not excuse what was done. It does not return Coulson to the living, or unsay the things that were said to the people of Stuttgart on their knees. Pain does not make damage disappear. It only explains the shape of it. But Thor holds it alongside the rest, the grief and the anger and the relief of having him back, even like this, even in chains, even still not entirely sure what he is bringing home. It is complicated. It was always going to be complicated. This is what it is to love someone who is also, sometimes, your enemy. These are the things worth carrying forward from this chapter. Not the battle, which was vast and fierce, and is already softening at its edges, as battles do when enough time passes. Not the destruction, or the chaos, or the drama of any given moment in the sky above Manhattan. What stays? A man with a bow, walking into danger, because that was what the situation required, and someone had to. A woman who closed a portal, while everyone else was still deciding if it was possible. a soldier who stopped a fight between gods by making the simple, unarguable case for stopping, a scientist who held something enormous inside himself and used it carefully and deliberately in service of others, and then sat at a table afterward and was very still, out of consideration for everyone nearby. A man who flew alone through a closing portal because the math said it needed to be done. And somewhere in a restaurant in Manhattan, 6 empty chairs around a table. The meal long over. The city outside, finding its way back to quiet, the way cities do. Slowly, then all at once. Let that image settle. Let the warmth of it come to rest. You have nowhere to be tonight. Whatever the day held is behind you now, and the night is doing what night does, gathering the world in something softer, slower, darker, in the way that darkness is restful rather than frightening. Let your breathing find its own pace, easy and even. There's no urgency in this moment. Somewhere through the bifrost, Thor is bringing his brother home. The chains are there. The complicated love is also there. Both things true at once, the way the hardest things often are. He does not know yet what comes next. He knows only that he is not the same person who left Asgard looking for a wayward brother. He has sat at a human table and understood something about worthiness that all the golden halls of his home could not have taught him. He learned it from 6 people eating shawarma. Let your eyes close a little more. The restaurant is quiet now. The stars above Manhattan are the same stars that will hang above New Asgard one day, above a Norwegian shore where the story continues. They are not interested in worthiness, those stars. They shine regardless, on the chosen and the unchosen alike, on the gods and the mortals and everything in between that is still finding out what it is. They burn on. Sleep now. The meal is done, and the stars are very close. Worthiness, it turns out, was never about the hammer. It was never about strength or thunder or even victory. It was about the willingness to keep reaching for something greater, even when everything has been taken away. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. If you're still awake, thank you for listening. If you've already drifted off, sleep well. The Sanctum will be here when you return. If you enjoyed this story, a like or subscribe helps other people find their way here too. Good night.